Welcome to Tokyo Inklings. My name is CY, but you might know me as Tokyo Station Pens on Instagram.
And my name is Jacob, and you may know me as Foodafan on Instagram, and I have a blog at foodafan.com.
Episode 1. Tokyo Inklings is a podcast focused on the fountain pen world in Japan. And we wanted to start this podcast because there's not a lot of information on fountain pens and the general fountain pen scene in Japan in the English language. You find some scattered bits and pieces, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jacob, in Japanese. But that information is quite scattered and it's not really in a unified form. And certainly I don't think there's an audio form of information in about fountain pens in Japan.
Right, there are a few blogs here and there, some of them quite cryptic, and there's even less information in English. Of course, our friend Bruno has done an amazing job explaining the pen scene in Japan over the years on his blog, but we think there is an opportunity here to do a podcast where we talk about the pen scene, new brands, new models, and so on.
Yes, exactly. And so this podcast aims to deliver a kind of insider's perspective on what's arguably the holy land of stationery. And speaking of which, Jacob, what do you think it is about Japan that makes it that holy land? Because every time I go on online forums and especially fountain pen related, everybody seems to really focus and hone in on Japan as this is the place for stationery.
Yes, I'm sure there are many factors here, but one observation many people make when they come to Japan is that this is a very paper-based society. So whether you go to the ward office to renew your residence card, or you go to Yodobashi to get a new phone, you sign up for a new credit card or bank account, or even go to your local gym to sign up, you're going to be filling out paper forms, often lots and lots of paper forms. This is also a place where people use paper planners a lot. Many salarymen have these ubiquitous black faux leather Nolte planners, for example. And this is also, I would say, a place where they do emphasize handwriting. They put a lot of attention on handwriting. So I have a son in elementary school, and in his Japanese or Kokugo class, they spend a lot of time perfecting these hane, tome, and harai strokes that make up Japanese characters. So it's not enough for the characters to be legible. They have to be beautiful as well. So if you're going to be doing this much handwriting, starting from an early age, you might as well have a nice pen.
So just for our audio listeners, Jacob, can you explain to me what those strokes are exactly?
The hane stroke is that little hook, and the tome stroke is this just straight line, and then the harai stroke is this side stroke that is perhaps the one that takes the longest to perfect, and that ties into perhaps later discussions about naginata togi nibs and so on that are meant to make the harai strokes in particular beautiful.
Right, and I think we're going to talk a lot about that particular grind, especially even in future episodes. But that's interesting because it seems like then there is a national, let's say, focus on writing even specific strokes. It's not even about character forming yet, but particularly on when you put the pen to paper, how important it is for each stroke to come out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I would say that I think one reason why you have a wide variety of specialty nibs here and so on. Of course, that is not just unique to Japan. You have interesting nibs in China as well. But obviously, Asian handwriting differs from Western handwriting. To make the characters as beautiful as possible, there are different kind of nibs you can use.
Right, and I think it's interesting because you mentioned that obviously there are places that that focus on handwriting outside of Japan, but I also think something else that makes Japan quite special is that it's kind of let's say the land of fandom. There are a lot of fandoms here in Japan, and then when we get away from the, as you said, the regular black diaries that the salarymen all seem to have, you also move into this area where there are a lot of say cute washi tape collectors, and something that we'll touch on later, of course, is that a lot of the newer people who are getting into fountain pens seem to be younger, more female oriented, and very much into inks. Um, so I think there's definitely an aspect of fandom in the scene as well, and that helps the scene thrive not just in fountain pens but in stationery generally overall. That people are really focused on collecting cute little bits of things that they can use in their everyday lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that at the pen shows, we see that at the pen club meetings where we go. I guess we'll talk more about that later. But you have in the pen club groups here, you have broadly two categories of people. You have the older collectors who are more into vintage pens. They're looking for their Banner pens and so on. And on the other hand, you have a younger generation of people who are sort of Kakuno hackers. They like inks, they like paper planners, they like washi tape and just cute stationery. And what I like about our pen clubs here is it has room for both of these groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I think is that um, something that's quite different from, let's say, the United States is that I think Japan is quite small, uh, physically in terms of geography. So a lot of the stores, at least in Tokyo, are quite accessible to everybody. Even the furthest stores, I'd say Pen Point in Tama, maybe it takes you an hour and a half on the train to get there. So it's not inaccessible, and as a result, at least compared to the US, it seems like there's a much more thriving brick and mortar culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are several reasons why they're popular. Especially in Tokyo, they're more accessible. It's not uncommon to go shopping during lunch or after work. Also, what these retail stores do well is that they do events like pen clinics, ink blending workshops, hand lettering workshops. They often have cafes. It's an experience to go there. They are, as you say, still thriving. So on that note, maybe we should do a quick overview of what stores we have here.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's also a good opportunity to look at not only the brick and mortars, but also generally how the scene works. I mean, there are a lot of different players, right? There are brick and mortars, there are online retailers, you have auctions, shows, and then
Yeah.
pen clubs. And this is going to be a deep, deep topic. But let's go over a bit how in general the scene works before we jump into the exact stores.
Yes, so retail stores, you have a few old ones, big old ones that have been around for a while. They have a wide selection of pens. And then you have a number of smaller specialty stores that tend to focus on a limited edition pens and inks and so on. Then you have, as we mentioned before, various pen clubs. I guess we'll talk about that more later. There are various events throughout the year. There are ink-focused events, there are paper-focused events, there are general stationery events, there are fountain pen events, both for new pens and for vintage pens. And of course, there's a big second-hand market also online. So that's broadly the scene, I would say.
I think that's interesting because I think when we talk about then brick and mortars, there are two very distinct types of brick and mortar stores, as you mentioned. That the old stores that kind of carry all of the let's say the classic items, your black Pilot Custom 74s, your Sailor Prophet 1911s, platinum, of course. But then you have a different type of brick and mortars that almost make all of their money based on exclusive um, releases. And it seems to me that the second type, which are focused on exclusives, are close but not exactly the same to online retailers in the sense that they depend on the exclusives, the store exclusives, and the other special products that they come out with to survive. But as a result, there is almost a feverish, let's say, obsession with these second types of brick and mortars, and they seem to get a lot of attention from especially the younger crowd.
Yeah,
What do you
absolutely.
think?
And I think those smaller stores that are focused on limited editions, I think they are targeting the enthusiast community, while the bigger ones are some of the customers are people just buying gifts, graduation gifts and so on. And you don't necessarily need a limited edition for that. You want your black
Hmm.
custom 74.
Right. And I know, Jacob, you are a big fan of Maruzen.
Yes, so let's talk a bit about the stores. Big two, of course, are Itoya and Maruzen. So Maruzen has been around for over 150 years, and it's been hugely influential in Japan. And I think we should probably do a separate episode just about Maruzen because there's so much to talk about there. But they have their flagship store in Nihonbashi with a wide selection of both Japanese pens and imported pens. And you will find not so many, I would say, limited editions as such, but you will find some pens that aren't widely available elsewhere, like these sailor pens for left-handed people, for example. And of course, they have inks, including their own line of Athena inks, which, by the way, have been around for over 100 years. And not far from Maruzen, you have Itoya's flagship store in Ginza with 12 or I believe 13 floors. Of which one is just dedicated to fountain pens and ink. And they sometimes have some limited editions, typically pilot pens. Again, they're not really focused on exclusives and limited editions, I would say, but they have a very wide variety of pens.
It seems like Itoya is really they have a good relationship with Pilot, of course, so they have these special Pilot pens that are Itoya exclusives. But we don't really hear about that, do we? Because it's still kind of the muted, more focused towards either gift items or let's say office work
Yeah, absolutely.
rather than
Neither
hobby.
Maruzen nor Itoya are big on social media or even online. So they both have online stores, but they only have a few items there, and their social media
Hmm.
accounts are not even close to what you find in the Western world with up to date product releases and so on. So they seem to focus on the brick and mortar
Hmm.
store, the traffic they get there, and
Hmm.
some of the other stores they don't even sell online. I guess we'll get more into that later, but there are some stores that don't sell anything online. They want you to come to the store to buy their inks and so on.
Yeah. And those tend to be the ones with these super exclusive limited editions, right? I mean, the one in Shizuoka. Let's talk a bit
Yeah,
about
so
that.
there's this chain of stores in Shizuoka called Bungokan Kobayashi. I haven't actually been there myself, but I believe there's one of them in particular in Shizuoka city that has these Kobayashi inks, which are very popular here. And they also have their
Mm,
own limited edition sailor pens. There are two ways you can buy them. Either you go to Shizuoka to the store, or a few times a year they attend events in Tokyo. So Tokyo International Pen Show and the Tone and Limbs shows and so on. But you cannot generally buy these pens online.
yes, so I've actually tried to do it, and they're very active on Instagram. So I sent them a message on Instagram, and I had to beg them to ship me. And their response to me was like, "Oh, we don't really ship, uh, but maybe we'll do it for you. We'll consider about it." So I think part of their trade is, of course, limiting the availability of these pens in that you can't get these pens. So when we're at a show, y'all better
Yeah,
line
and
up.
it seems to work both at the Tokyo International Pen Show and at the smaller shows we've been to. The longest queue tends to be to Kobayashi's booth, and the newest inks they sell out in minutes.
Yeah, I waited. How long? I waited for like an hour to get to Kobayashi. And when I got there, they said, "Oh yeah, our ink sold out in 14 minutes. I'm sorry."
Yes, a few months ago we went to a Tono and Limbs ink event, and Kobayashi sold 3 new inks with some glitter. And not only did you need a ticket to get into the actual ink event, you needed a special ticket to buy these Kobayashi Tono and Limbs ink.
Yes, if you weren't there early, you were gone. And that's how a lot of these brick and mortars survive, right? They make a lot of their money on these events, and then in the regular season, let's say when they're at their home stores, they invite people to come out and visit their stores. And that's something that's quite interesting because all over Japan, in these brick and mortar stores, they have special deals with mostly Sailor, and they call them the Gotochi ink.
Another ink brand, and we mentioned that briefly before, but another ink brand you see a lot more of, starting last year really, is Tono and Lims, which is this Korean Japanese brand, and they have really gotten into this whole limited edition store exclusive games. So there's so many shops, big and small, that have their own Tono and Lims inks now. As friends of us, they just started their own shop. They already have their own limited edition Tono and Lims inks. So that is something that has just exploded for the last few months.
Yeah, and do you think this helps the brick and mortar stay in business?
I'm not sure. I was wondering about these stores up in, Hirosaki and Hiroshima.
Right.
I haven't been to most of these stores. I don't know how many customers that they get on a daily basis, but you can't help wondering if it wouldn't make sense for them to at least try online selling.
So I've been to the one in Nagasaki
Right.
Manenjitsu Byoin. And it's this old school kind of store. It looks like a pharmacy. You know those pharmacies where you go in and it's like all glass, and then there's the medicine cabinet, and then you sit down from the pharmacist and you have a chat.
Right.
So it looks exactly like that. And they have a store exclusive King of Pen. And I think when I was there, we were there 20 minutes. There were a group of three people who came in. And I think a lot of these older stores in, let's say, the countryside, they're driven by their existing clientele that have been going to these stores for a long time. And I think um, actually something that might be interesting is that in the more countryside areas, I wonder if we have a higher percentage of fountain pen users since it's more conservative, and a lot of these people, their grandparents, their parents would have been using fountain pens and going regularly to these
Yeah,
stores.
it's a good question, and I think it would be interesting to do a separate episode about those shops. Where a friend of ours, Daniel, has been to most, if not all of them, and has a lot of stories to tell. So I would love to do a separate episode with him about the Inaka pen scene.
Yeah. Let's move on to online retailers then.
Yeah, so we mentioned Itoya and Marusen, and they don't have much online presence. Then you have Bangbox, quite famous in the West. They have this tiny little shop in one of the Jingumae back streets, but they also have an online store. I imagine that they get a fair number of overseas orders through their online store.
But Jacob, Bungabox also you didn't mention, they're actually not based in
Yes,
Tokyo.
their first store was in Hamamatsu, but I know that Kaoru has moved to Tokyo, so runs the Tokyo store now. But you're right that they're the first and the biggest store is in Hamamatsu.
Yeah, and that's interesting because then it's like Tokyo is like their second store. When I go there, they say that their Honten or their
Yeah.
main store is in Hamamatsu, and I don't know the ratio of the products that they have there.
Yeah, because again, the Tokyo store is so small. They have a few pens, there's a little bit of paper, but that's pretty much it. And you can be maybe a max like 4 or 5 people in the shop. Another shop here that has both brick and mortar and online is the Kingdom Note in Shinjuku, which has sort of similar concept to Bangbox in the sense that they have the limited edition sailor pens, they have their own line of inks. But what Kingdom Note is also known for is their second-hand markets. They buy and sell second-hand pens, and it might be one of the best places to buy otherwise sold out limited edition pens. And we have friends that are always looking at the latest inventory updates on Kingdom Note to see if something new has come in.
You can also sell your pens back to Kingdom Note. So they both trade in new pens, of course, but I'd say their main business is the exclusives and the secondhand stuff. And then to our favorite type of store, Yahoo.
Yes, we like Yahoo Auctions. We send each other links to auctions there. So Yahoo Auctions is like a Japanese eBay, and if you're looking for some rare anniversary sailor bamboo pen with some exotic nib or some old pilot pen with a interesting filling system, then Yahoo Auctions might be the best place. I think prices have gone up recently as it has become more accessible to overseas buyers, but there's a lot of interesting vintage stuff there.
Mm,
Um, Another good place to buy
mm,
second-hand pens is Mercari, which, unlike Yahoo, is not an auction. Mercari calls itself a Frimaapi or flea market app, so the seller decides on the price. And sometimes you can negotiate the price in a comment section. But Mercari is very popular in Japan. People sell all kinds of stuff on Mercari, and you often find people who clearly aren't really into fountain pens. They are, selling their grandfather's pens or whatever. They don't really know what it is. They put up a blurry photo, and the description doesn't necessarily make sense. But you can find some fantastic prices there for that reason. But you have to be active because those
yeah.
good deals on Mercari, they disappear in seconds. It's like a flash on the screen. But if you put in the time, you can find some amazing deals on Mercari.
So Jacob, did I ever tell you that I used to
Tell me
live with
about
the
it.
founder of Medicati? No, when he was starting out, we were living in this small shared apartment. He had the smallest room. He was probably the hardest working guy that I've ever met in my life. But I mean, obviously, Mercari is a huge success now, not just for fountain pens, but for all sorts of items. And Mercari is very interesting because, as you said, a lot of people who don't know what they're selling tend to sell on Mercari because they just want to get, let's say, a quick buck.
Yeah, you said that Mercari is very popular. It's one of the few Japanese tech unicorns. They had a successful IPO a few years ago, so they're very big.
The secondhand market is obviously extremely active because these Yahoo auctions, I mean, my goodness, they are like they it's like a war zone out there. Like, you need to get on top of what you want if you really want it. And sometimes, especially for the rare stuff, you better be prepared to pay
Yeah, so
big money.
you and I have different approaches there. You chase the rare collector's editions, while I buy the most boring standard production pens. If you want to get like a Mont Blanc 146 cheaply, then Yahoo Auctions is perfect because at any time there's going to be like 50 listings, and there's only so much interest out there, so you're likely to get a good price on at least one of them.
Yeah, but then with all these Montblancs, somebody always seems to be bidding on it, and I just don't know who's who.
Yeah, I'm sure some of that are, people like Fuji-san from Eurobox. If he sees that he can get something for a lower price, then he will be able to resell it at his shop.
Yeah, and that's just it's just quite interesting that it seems that even though when we go to shows or when we meet up, it doesn't seem like there are too many um, younger people in the main clubs, at least the general conception. But then when you go on the Yahoo auctions, a lot of these pens that you think all the collectors already have, actually there are a lot.
At least for Yahoo Auctions, I think you have people outside Japan, especially like Taiwan and Hong Kong and China, that are bidding for some of the more exotic collector's items. If you want to get the new pen at a good price, you don't have to go online. There are these discount shops in Tokyo, and I think my favorite is Marui Shoten. So you take the train to Okachimachi Station, this older part of Tokyo. You get off the train and there's this older sort of worn down building with some small shops there. They're selling lighters, they're
Yeah,
selling some souvenirs and some cheap looking gadgets. And then you see this kiosk, and it looks like the kind of place where you would buy like a pack of cigarettes or a newspaper. But you look closely at
yeah.
the display and say, hey, that's a Mont Blanc Hemingway. That is a Pelican Macchier. That is a custom Yotsubishi with Raden decoration. There's a Sailor King of Pen, Platinum Izumo, and so on. So you have this small little shop that has this amazing collection of rare high-end pens. And not only that, but the prices are good. So for many of the Japanese pens, at least, it's 30% off retail price. So not only is it 30% cheaper than Itoya and Maruzen, but it's often cheaper than you can find on Amazon and Rakuten. And it's a proper legit shop. They give you a Japanese warranty, but you do
Right.
have to pay cash. That's the only catch, I guess.
So I helped Mr. Paperlate Slack when he was here in Japan. We went over to Maruya and we bought a custom urushi, and he said it was like 50% off of what they were asking for in the US. And the interesting thing is that whether you buy online, I think if for eBay, a lot of people are worried about like scams and are they actually going to get what they actually ordered? Especially with Mont Blanc, I think a lot of people are worried that they may get fakes when they buy off of eBay. But I've never had to worry about that when ordering from Yahoo Auctions or Mercari. If I see a picture, obviously, exercising my good judgment, but
the only problem I sometimes have is if you're trying to buy a sailor. So what's called 1911S and 1911L in EU and US is called Prophet 21 here, and Prophet 21 Standard. And people sometimes aren't sure whether they're selling Prophet Standard or Prophet 21. And I have at least on 2 occasions bought the small one when I thought I was buying the big one.
But I actually have been a bit disappointed in my purchases a few times, but mostly buying Western pens. Bought 2 Wahl Eversharps that was a bit disappointed with, and those are pretty expensive pens. Anyways, let's go on to our next topic, which is pen clubs and shows.
So there are a few pen clubs here in Japan, and I think, as far as I know, the biggest one is Wagner, which we're both a member of. And Wagner has these club meetings and events all over Japan. And here in Tokyo, they have the so-called Teireikai, or regular meetings in Suidobashi, a few times a year. And the way these meetings work is that in the morning, people are just chatting with each other. There's a little bit of trading going on, and then in the afternoon there is usually a presentation of some kind. When I've been there a few times, it's been Mr. Pilot, as we call him. He's been talking about pilot history and so on. So these are fairly small events, and then a few times a year they have bigger events. So there's the spring event, there's the autumn event, there's the year-end bazaar. And then there's the biggest one of them all, which is the pen trading in Tokyo. Usually around Golden Week, but this year I think it's in June. And that is usually a 2-day or a 3-day event where, again, you have both the vintage collectors and the vintage traders with lots and lots of black ebonite pens of various kinds. And you have people like Fuji-san from Eurobox is usually there. Tsunami-san, who is known for his book with the Lambro fountain pens of Japan, he's usually there looking for deals. But then you also have the younger generation, people who are selling these, these decorated Kakuno pens with fish bowls and crescent fillers, and some people making their own pen cases or their own planners and so on. It's so fun to see. At one table you have these crescent filler Kakunos, and at the next table you have Mr. Pilot with his old anniversary Pilot.
Yeah. So Wagner clearly is a big part of the enthusiast ecosystem in Japan. I don't think there are any pen enthusiasts who aren't aware of Wagner. But Wagner is also quite special, right? Because it's a bit of a
yeah. So Wagner is led by Mr. Mori. Actually, Wagner has been around for I think over 15 years now. I don't know if he's been in charge the whole time, but he's definitely the one in charge now, and he is running these events. He is also working with pen makers to produce Wagner exclusive pens every year. So it's usually some kind of platinum, because he's a good friend with Platinum's president. And sometimes there are these Taiwanese pens from Fine Writing International. So every year he's selling those. And he's also a pen doctor himself. So he's offering nib grinding at these pen shows.
Yeah, and I've never personally had one of his grinds because obviously I grind myself, so I have no need for his services. But he claims to have ground the most platinum pens outside of Platinum, the company.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to verify that claim, but he does seem to do a lot of nib grinding. So what he's done, I think last year or the year before, he started separate from Wagner. He started his own pen clinic. So there's a small, I think there's actually just an apartment in Mita in Tokyo that he has turned into his own, I think it's called a Danwashi, so like fountain pen lounge. And at this fountain pen lounge, he does pen clinics. So
Right.
you have to make a reservation in advance, I believe, and you go there, and he offers all kinds of, pen repair and custom grinds. And he has a few signature grinds that he does. There's one called Natatogi, which is meant to mimic some
Yep.
vintage Mont Blanc grinds. I
Mm.
think he is involved in this new company called Lichtop. So it's a bit of a tangent, but there's a Wagner member called Tomoko. She is a full-time musician, I believe, but she's also quite a fountain pen enthusiast and also doing nib grinding, or at least nib adjustment. And she recently started this company called Lichtop, and she is selling pens and inks and paper. Ink she sells is two exclusive Toner and Lims inks, and the pens she sells are these Taiwanese Penlux pens. I think she has an exclusive black version of it. And she's selling these letter writing kits, these Japanese Ipitsusen letter writing kits, which I think were produced in collaboration with Beshori, who is a famous Japanese hand lettering artist. So this is sort of a spin-off from Wagner, and I'm pretty sure that Mori-san is involved because he's at least promoting this Lichtop business heavily.
Yeah. And then the last thing about Wagner is that it's quite a old club.
Yes, that's definitely true. There's this new generation, the Kakuno hackers and so on. But you're right that if you go to the Suidobashi meetings in particular, that's definitely predominantly an older generation and mostly male. They are into vintage pens. Yes, and they know each other very well. That they have been doing this for decades.
Yeah, and it's a bit of an old boys club. But let's contrast this with Bungu Joshi and Inkunuma and Kamihaku and these more ink-oriented events, which seem to lean
so
more
Kamihaku
female.
is interesting because it's a show that is all about paper. So this is the place where you will find all kinds of notebooks, including these beautiful Japanese artisan, handmade notebooks, and you find all kinds of washi paper. You find postcards, planner refills, and so on. And this is a big show because the venue is the same as for Tokyo International Pen Show. But Tokyo International Pen Show is just one floor. Kamihaku is 2 floors. So this is a very big event. But it's not the biggest stationary event here. The biggest one, I believe, is Bungu Joshi Haku, which is held once a year in December, I believe. And it's held out in Tokyo Ryutsu Center, out in Tokyo Bay, which is this enormous exhibition hall. And this is very much a stationary show. It's all kinds of stationery. There is some fountain pen stuff. I've been there once and I saw Nagasawa, I saw Sailor, I think I saw Kobayashi too. But it's a lot of washi tape, there's a lot of ballpoints, there's a lot of planners and so on. But last year or the year before, there were 35,000 attendees. So this is an enormous show.
Right. And people are saying, oh, TIP's got 3,000 people, biggest pen show. But clearly there are some bigger players.
And last year they did a spin-off show called Inkunuma, which was fantastic because so we talked earlier about these small retail shops all over Japan, in like Fukushima, in Shizuoka, in Aomori, whatever. At this Inkunuma show, all of these retailers finally came together, so you could buy all of those Kobayashi inks, the Hirayama Mandendo inks, the Pentanote inks, the Usagiya inks, all in one place. And of course, given how popular ink is right now, there was a lot of people at this event. And I know there's already planned for a new event this year, and I'm sure there will be even more people. And of course, as with any ink event, they had their own show exclusive inks. So Bungu Joshi had teamed up with Sailor to produce a line of inks called Koimoyo, and you had to line up early if you wanted to get a chance to buy those. And we also knew that some of the vendors like Kobayashi and Usagiya, they had told people in advance that they had limited stock, so people really wanted to get there early to buy the most sought after inks.
Right. And it was crazy because you actually had to buy tickets to go into the show in advance, and it wasn't like they were unlimited. You could only buy a certain number of there were only a certain number of tickets released for the show, and the show was
Yes, yes.
divided into
So
three parts, wasn't it?
like the morning and early afternoon, and then like evening, something like that, right? And so you had like 2 or 3 hours, actually very well
Yeah.
organized because you didn't have to pay at each table. Instead, you got a big shopping cart and you just added whatever ink
Yep.
you wanted from all the booths, and then you paid for all of it in the end, which of course was also very dangerous because you didn't have a clear idea of how much you had spent until you stood there at the cash register and realized that you had bought way too much ink.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they replenished during each session. So it was over 2 days, six
Mm.
sessions, and each session had its own replenishment. So just because you got the first
Yeah.
session doesn't mean that you get to buy
And
whatever
yes,
you
so,
want.
so this was a very popular show, but it wasn't the only like ink-centric show. I think the first one was last year or the year before. Itoya had its own show called Ink, 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 and the concept was that they had, I think, 1,000 different types of ink, 1,000 different bottles. So you could go there, or you paid, and you got a little ink testing notebook and a dip pen, and you get to walk around and sample all the inks, and then you could buy whichever inks you wanted. The difference, I think, between Ink, Ink, Ink and the Ink Numa show was that while Ink, Ink, Ink had more international inks, you had Ackerman, your Diamond, your Private Reserve, all kinds of foreign brands. The Ink Numa show was almost entirely Japanese, so it was all of these regional store exclusive sailor inks.
Yeah. And I went to Ink 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 this year, and I would certainly say that Ink Numa was more fun, more interesting. They had many more inks that were special and that you don't see often, even from these online retailers and the countryside retailers. And I think that really highlights the difference between the kind of traditional old brick and mortars and these newer, um, again, more younger
Yeah, I think
focused, more
that's true
female
too. And
focused.
there's a third ink-centric show that was also popular, and that was Tono and Lim's own ink show. So they have had like 2 or 3 of them so far. So the idea is they gather together all of these shops that sell Tono and Lim's ink, so you can buy them all in one place. You have, End Paper, Hirayama Manden, and so on. The last one was in Okamotoya, which is a stationary retailer. That show wasn't as well organized as some of the others. Do you want to explain why?
Yeah. So Okamoto is a retailer, and they own this office building out in a place called Toranomo. It's fairly close to Ginza, so it's fairly central. The interesting thing about them is that they open on weekdays and Saturday, but they don't open on Sundays, and they close at 6 o'clock in the evening. So it's not exactly worker friendly, but they are a very old, very storied, I believe, retailer of stationery, not just the fountain pens, but stationery in general. And they're kind of one of the old players, so that's why they have this entire building. And usually, regularly, when you go there, you can go to the first and the second floor. But for the event, they opened up their office spaces on, I think, first, second, third, fourth, and 10th floor. Not all the floors were open, but uh, because the space is not regularly used for events, and the organization, especially in terms of the foot flow, the traffic management, wasn't very strong. An example of this would be that in order to go up, you either take the elevator or the stairs, but there's only one elevator. So it goes all the way up to the 10th floor and all the way down. But then in the stairs, the stairwell is quite small because if you can imagine a smaller office building near Ginza, it's not exactly the largest space you have. So you had a lot of people, I would say, hundreds of people lining up on the stairwell. It was difficult to get up and down. Our friend who went, she got to the first floor, looked around, looked at the line, and said, "I have a headache. I can't go up there anymore." But but it wasn't very well organized in terms of the traffic and the foot flow. So as a result, you had this chaotic situation where a lot of people weren't able to get what they wanted. and didn't know where things were. But at the same time, it was quite an interesting show because you had, I think, every single
Yeah.
tonal limbs
And they
ever
were meant to
made
do another
was
show
at the show.
like that this month, but because of the virus situation, it has now been postponed to April, but I'm not sure that that will happen either. Eventually, they will do another one of these shows. They're actually still kind of fun because it feels like a treasure hunt, right?
It's a flea market. Yeah, but definitely not as well run as Inkinuma, which I think is probably the best run show that we have in Japan. All right, now let's move on to our next segment of Q&A. Jacob, we have had a lot of questions submitted by people that I sourced from Slack and Instagram, and there are some really interesting questions here. So let's get right into it.
Yeah.
Inky Cat asks, what is your favorite grind to use and for Tokyo Station pens to do? So I think this is a question just on what we use daily, and for me, what I like to make or grind for other people. So why don't you start us off, Jacob?
Sure. So for me, I would say, as my Instagram account name suggests, I do like Fude nibs. I do like the fact that they give you these broad brush-like strokes. They're very fun to use for hand lettering, for example. I also like Concord nibs. And actually, a bit of a tangent, I just read in a recent issue of Shumi no Bungobaku about the history behind the Concord nib. It was explained that an artist came to Sailor's nib grinder Nagahara and asked for a nib for drawing, and that became the Concord nibs.
Very interesting.
And the third one I would mention is Naginata Togi. Both of us like Naginata Togi nibs. I don't write much Japanese with my Naginata Togi nibs. So for me, a Naginata Togi is more of a more forgiving and perhaps more refined version of an architect nib. So you still get some of that, those broad side strokes, but you don't risk cutting through the paper if you don't hold it at the intended angle. So those would be the three nibs for me.
Right. And Jacob, you are a left-handed underwriter.
I'm a left-handed underwriter, but it works perfectly for me.
Yeah. And interesting because I think mostly you write cursive with your Naginata Togis.
Yes.
Yeah. So for me, I do enjoy the Naginata. I have to admit that I'm not very good with it, but I do enjoy writing with it. And I am trying to practice more Japanese and Chinese handwriting. So that helps. I've also found that for the best looking Chinese characters, it's actually not the Naginata, but the Fude nibs. So in the Chinese speaking areas, they actually call the Fude nib, they call it the calligraphy grind. So that's one of my favorites as well. I've been studying and trying to make these. And then finally, for my own personal use, for English language writing, I usually use oblique italics, as well as flex. So if they're not flex, they're oblique or flexi oblique. Now, as for the ones that I like to grind, um, I really think that there aren't a lot of people who grind naginatas in general, and they're quite difficult because you need to get this balance in terms of symmetry, but also it's quite difficult to get that sharp point correct for the harai stroke that you mentioned earlier. But I do like making those. I also like flexifying 14K pilot nibs. That's probably more of my signature that I do. I do a 3-time flex music nib, though those are quite complex and takes quite a long time to make. And then of course, when I grind for myself, I always grind into a oblique italic. All right, so let's move on to our next question. Let's see. B-Box from Slack asks, what's the most friendly, fountain pen friendly paper in Japan? Is it also Tomoe River? I know you have a lot to say about this.
So I'm not actually sure what's the most popular one, but I remember not long ago I went to this store called Kakimori in Kuramai.
Mm,
So Kakimori is this really interesting notebook store. Their concept is that you make your own notebook. So you go there, you
mm,
choose your own paper, you choose your own binding, you choose your own covers and so on, and they make it for you. And they have this big bookshelf full of various kinds of paper, many of which I've never heard of before. And
mm,
for each paper type, this little description, like they describe, the properties of that paper and whether it is fountain pen friendly. And I
mm,
remember for Tomoe River, they had this motto. So it was fountain pen friendly, but it was not the ultimate in fountain pen friendliness. There were a few other paper types. I think it was some kind of
mm, mm,
food scrap that was considered even more fountain pen friendly. I think also bank paper, I can't remember exactly, but there were definitely a few types that were more considered by Kakimori to be more fountain pen friendly.
mm. So, actually, kind of to jump in on a separate tangent as well, this actually links quite well to one of the another questions that we received at Dara Pens on Instagram asks why Japanese stationery, specifically paper, is so much more fountain pen friendly. Uh, so, when you went to Kakimori, were there any hints?
Well, so no, because they didn't really describe, if I remember correctly, what they meant by fountain pen friendliness. But that's what I think you may have a difference. What makes paper fountain pen friendly? And since we talked about before that the fact that people use paper planners a lot, they write their to-do lists and so on the go and at cafes and so on. I think people prefer fast drying paper in
Mm,
Japan, perhaps consider that to be more important than sheen and shading.
mhm. I think to try to answer both these questions at the same time, I think that um, when you have a market where something is really, really well done, in order to compete, you have to be at least similar in terms of level, right? So I don't want to talk about Tomoe River for the moment, but let's say your regular um, campus or life or MD paper. A lot of people are much more familiar with those, and the paper quality is quite frankly very, very good. So um, I think in order to compete in the Japanese market, you need paper that you can write anything with. And I think the uh, relative prevalence of brush pens in Japan, um, and as you mentioned earlier, the Ipitsen that Lichtop is selling, I think the point of the Japanese manufacturers is to try to make paper that anybody can write with any type of product, any kind of pen. And of course, then that includes fountain pens. So I think they try to do more testing with with the products that they produce, and I think that's why you see a higher fountain pen friendliness in terms of paper produced in Japan. In terms of the most popular, though, I would say for the regular person, you I think MD is probably more popular than Sakai Technical, which produces Tomoe River, in terms of their own notebooks.
Yeah, I think that's
But
probably true. And that goes back to what you said about paper being suitable for different types of pens. I remember
yeah,
seeing some kind of marketing material for Midori MD where they specifically talked about how nice it is to write on MD paper with pencils.
yep,
Because if you have very highly
yes,
coated paper, then it's not very pencil friendly, right? While
yeah,
MD paper has this bit of a texture to it, so it's suitable for both pencils and fountain pens.
yes. But on the other hand, the most popular planner is probably Hobonichi.
I'm not sure if that's the case. At the end of the year, you have these shops everywhere selling planners. The bigger shops, your Itoyas and so on, they have, Jibun Tetsuo, Hobonichi and so on. But if you go to your local bookstore around the corner, they're going to have High Tide and Midori and Nolte, which are sort of
Yes, Nolte.
cheaper types of planners.
So Midori makes their own planner?
Yeah, so I think the parent company Midori is Design Field or something like that, and they have a wide
Right,
range of planners
right.
across their brands.
And they make plotter too,
Yes.
right? Yeah. But yeah, I would say generally MD paper is probably more prevalent in the market. Tomoe River, they have their own line of notebooks that's made by Sakai Technical, but I think those notebooks are not very common. The Tomoe River notebooks. What is more common is then the Hobonichi. So most of the Tomoe River you find in Japan is either in loose leaves or in Hobonichi. That's how I feel.
Yeah, nowadays you're starting to see these Sakai Technical paper notebooks, but that is a recent thing. You're right that people used Hobonichi before they used the Sakai Technical notebooks.
Yeah. And sorry to go off on another tangent, but the founder of Hobonichi is the creator of the video game Mother.
That I did not know.
So actually, a lot of again going back to fandom, a lot of people know Hobonichi as associated even with Nintendo. So that's kind of interesting. And they've released a book about the former Nintendo president and basically their friendship. So it's quite interesting. But anyways, are we ready to move on to our next and
Let's
final
do that.
question? All right. So a lot of people ask this, but Methanius asks, are there Western products the Japanese revere in the same almost mythical way Westerners revere some Japanese products? And on the same along the same lines, Sir Jerkface from Slack asks, what are the most prevalent slash popular Western pens and stationery items in Japan? All right, so I think this is an easy one, Jacob.
Yeah, so I'll say the three most popular Western pen brands would be Montblanc, Pelikan, but also Lamy, I would say. You have a lot of older collectors who have all kinds of Pelikans, all kinds of vintage models and so on. So there's a lot of Pelikan collecting going on, and many.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to your local Staya bookstore and office supply store that's not necessarily fountain pen focused, they might have a Lamy Safari and possibly a Pilot Kakuna, but no other types of fountain pens.
Yeah. I think Pelikan, you really got it right on the head that a lot of older collectors collect Pelikan. And with Montblanc, talking to one of our friends, and basically this has to really go back to the 70s and the 80s with the bubble era in Japan, where Japanese businessmen with wads of cash flying around basically just walked into the store and bought the most expensive thing there was. And so this friend that I talked to, her father would only buy Montblanc, not that he used it, but because it had the little white star, and that was quite important socially back then. I think Lamy, yes, there is a lot of Lamy flying around, and if you go to Itoya, most of the time the first floor has some kind of Lamy dedicated display. I found in the wild that a lot of people use the Lamy ballpoint pens. And I feel like those are pretty popular.
But
I would
so
also, yeah, go on.
you just want to add to that one Lamy model that is popular in the West, but you don't see much of in Japan is Lamy 2000.
Lamy 2000.
Because that is definitely not an entry-level pen here in Japan. You can get a pretty nice Sailor Prophet 21 for less than a Lamy 2000.
Right. And they don't advertise the Lamy 2000 in Itoya, do they? They advertise the Dialog 3.
That's true.
Yeah, so that's quite interesting, and you don't really see the Dialog 3 outside, I guess, in most of Lamy's marketing materials. But then the last brand I want to add to this actually is Aurora.
Yeah, that's true. So there are two types of shops, sort of lifestyle stores like Delphonics. They usually have the lower end Auroras, and then of course you go to the bigger stationery stores, and they have their 88s and Optimas and so on. And you also see them a lot online on the popular Instagram accounts here.
Yeah, I think you've just really hit the nail right on the head. with the Instagram. A lot of really cool Instagram accounts that you have in Japan, they're all using auroras. So I'm thinking Addicted
Yep.
Planner or Addicted Planner stickers. I don't remember exactly the account name. And also Aya, she's using Aurora. So I think Aurora is definitely something that's gaining a lot of traction
Yep.
here in Japan. All right, so that ends Tokyo Inklings episode 1. Hope you all enjoyed this content. We really look forward to hearing your feedback, things that you would like us to talk about, to incorporate, maybe some things that you would like us to delve deeper on. We'd love to hear more from you. Jacob, do you have anything else?
No, that's pretty much it. Obviously, this is the first episode. We haven't quite figured out the format yet, but hopefully we will figure this out eventually.
Yeah. Then with that, again, I'm CY. You can find me at Tokyo Station Pens on Instagram. That's Tokyo Station Pens on Instagram. And
yes,
Jacob?
You can find me on Instagram at Fudefan, and I also have a blog at fudefan.com.
So we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.